There's been some information that scenario 4 that the airport staff has recommended eliminates OEI protection. That is inherently false, because every airline has to have an OEI plan for every runway they operate off of. So the correct statement should be that scenario 4 wants to eliminate current OEI protections. But every airline operating out of that airport there has to have a plan for what happens when an engine fails on takeoff. In the pilot world, there's 3 numbers we calculate for every takeoff. The first number, we call it V1, V being speed, and 1, it's the first one we're going to reach, so kind of makes sense there. So that speed at V1, as the airplane is rolling down the runway, when it gets to that V1 speed, it can no longer stop on the runway. So even if we have a catastrophic failure at that V1 speed, we still have to take off, which is a little counterintuitive. You would think, oh, I want to stay on the ground. The engine just failed, but there's not enough runway left to stop. And so if you look out there at the end of the runway and go, okay, if we don't stop, where do we end up? 880?
The freeway, yep.
Yeah. Right. And we've seen accidents at an air show in Great Britain 2 years ago where a performance airplane didn't complete his loop, went off the end of the runway, hit the M5 motorway, and killed 22 people or something ridiculous like that. So big number there, V1. The next number is pretty easy because that's VR, and that just means rotate. That is where the pilots start to make the airplane lift off the ground. It doesn't have enough speed to fly, but it does have enough speed to start to lift off. And then the second speed we look at is we call V2. That's the speed required to fly and clear an obstacle off the end of the runway. Doesn't matter how high that obstacle is, doesn't matter, forget about the engineering side of it. We have to have that V2 speed to fly. So those are the 3 things the pilots are looking at. So OEI says we take the largest object inside the area kind of looks like that. Buildings get bigger as they go farther away from the airport, which makes sense if you think about it, because we have more time to climb. So your horizontal look at OEI is a big parabola, and then the vertical is this. So we calculate from the end of the runway to the highest obstacle that you would clear. This line is what the FAA says, okay, we know here's the building, we're going to add a little safety margin, and if you guys do everything right at the maximum performance of the airplane, you'll be on this line. Under our current OEI, maybe 5 or 6 flights a day are actually on this line if they lose an engine. All the other flights a day are somewhere up here. The Southwest 737 going to Los Angeles, he has more than enough performance. Even with a catastrophic engine failure, he'll be way above this minimum safety line. But Hainan, ANA, Lufthansa, and even in the summertime, Delta to Atlanta, JFK, United to Newark. If we get Miami service back, American to Miami would be impacted. Those flights are much closer to this line. They're at the maximum performance. As a general rule of thumb in aviation, the warmer the temperature gets, the less performance the airplane has. Technically, I can tell you it's because the air density is less and you need more air density, blah, blah, blah. But basically, as the temperature goes up, the airplane performance goes down. So, under scenario 4, airlines still have to have an OEI plan. They can't just say, well, we don't have a plan. Even though the FAA says it's economic, not really, because we still require the airlines to have a plan of what to do when the engine fails. So what scenario 4 does is it allows buildings up there. Now we see that those flights every day that were on this line, they're not going to clear that building. So that's where we come up with Hainan saying we're going to have to take off 51 seats because our airplane can't perform well enough in summertime temperatures to get above that. Or in the wintertime, we have to carry so much fuel to fight the headwinds in the Pacific, we can't get above that. Airplane gross weight is the empty weight of the airplane, the passengers, the fuel, and the cargo. The airplane doesn't matter what these numbers are, it just cares about that number. So when we do our performance on an 81.3 degree day in San Jose in August, we say if our maximum gross weight, and I'm throwing out numbers because I don't know the 787 numbers, but let's say that airplane takes off at 600,000 pounds is its maximum. On a hot day, maybe it can only do 580. So the airline has to decide, where does that 20,000 pounds come from? Well, we can't get rid of the fuel because we wouldn't make our destination. We can't change the empty weight of the airplane, so that's out. So we have two things that we can make our variable, cargo or passengers. So when airport staff talks about 21 passengers or 2,900 pounds of cargo, those are a little misleading because if the cargo is more profitable than the passengers, we're going to leave the passengers behind. As cold-blooded as that is to say, it comes down to economics. I've got $3 a pound per mile for cargo versus $1 a person per mile. I'm going to pick the cargo every time. So when you see the numbers from both scenario 10B and scenario 4, where they talk about a cargo penalty and a passenger penalty, you can kind of just mix all those numbers together because at the end of the day, it's going to be a penalty. So that's OEI in a nutshell. And with bigger buildings, we know these airplanes now can't go until they make some kind of weight adjustment. So our new line that just barely clears that building, and then the second new line, which is the FAA safety standard. Well, everybody says OEI is not a safety issue. Of course it is, because before we only had maybe 1 or 2 flights a day that were at the very minimum safety standard by the FAA. Everybody else was above that line. But now that we've increased that building height and our line has gone up and our safety line's gone above that, whereas we had 1 or 2 flights a day at the very minimum capability, now we have 25 flights a day, 30 flights a day. The higher the temperature goes, the higher that number of flights will be. All those flights now are operating at the very maximum capability of their airplane. So that brings it back to one of my jobs as a check pilot for Delta Airlines. Been doing check rides off and on for 30 years. I've never given a perfect check ride, nor have I myself ever accomplished a perfect check ride. And every pilot thinks they're the best pilot going, and I think I am the best. But if there's no perfect check ride, that means when this engine fails, the guys aren't going to do everything perfect. The pilots are human beings. So when we look at a horizontal view of the runway going off like that, when an engine fails on a 2-engine airplane, and that's basically what everybody is these days, whichever engine fails, the nose swings in that position because the operating thrust on the good engine pushes the nose of the airplane that way. So if we lose our left engine on takeoff roll, the airplane wants to go this direction. This is why American Airlines in 1996 said, you know what, that Adobe Tower is right here off the edge of the runway. We don't like that. That's way too close for our comfort level. And that's where that right turn out to Diridon Station originated. Because again, a heavy 777 going to Tokyo, engine failure, left engine fails. Let's say the wind is also coming from this direction. So actually, let's make it this direction, pushing the tail this way, even exasperating the amount the nose is going to want to swing. Guys are going to have to be quick. They've got to get the proper rudder in. They've got to get it properly trimmed. Plus, they're now fighting for altitude. And again, I've done it in the simulator where you're barely achieving a 100 foot per minute rate of climb at a maximum gross weight engine failure on a hot day. So the airplane is barely flying. So if everybody does everything perfect, the airplane continues straight out, we don't make the news. A mistake, or a series of mistakes that aren't trapped and mitigated against, now there's our first disaster. So, because American didn't like how close that tower was, let's go out to Deerdon Station, the highest point out there, SAP Center. This is going to look pretty great when it's all done. I don't know if anybody can understand it. But SAP Center, 202 feet, I think, mean sea level, 110 feet above the ground, something like that. Much lower obstruction, much more room to compensate for any errors the flight crews might make. So that's where we are. Questions?